The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Good morning. How's everybody doing? You cool? You know? Greetings to all the viewers. Sister Robin, let me know if you got your books. We mailed them out, I think, the beginning of the week. So greetings to M. Jewel, Steve McKenzie, Brother Ugawa, Ancient African Mindset. Let's see who else we have here. Sister Robin. And as others come in, greetings. I want to again say that I appreciate all the support that I'm getting from viewers for this show. The appreciation, it's mutual. To Shahid Douglas, Wolf Manlu, greetings to you as well. As the show's going on, encourage viewers to hit the like button so you can type something in on the chat feed to encourage them to hit the like button. And for new viewers, I don't know if Shahid Douglas is already subscribed. And don't buy my books at Amazon, buy them on Gumroad. You click right in to the description of the show, and it'll take you to the Gumroad address, and we can send those to you. I also want to encourage people to enroll in Sixfold Stages to Mental Freedom. To Jesse Paris, for Denver Mayor, Grand Rising from Denver, Colorado, greetings. We've had some important things going on. One is I want to thank Sister Coco for recommending me to Black Power Media. And I was on last Sunday on Easter. I think when the guy scheduled me, he didn't know it was Easter. So I had to go through some Kemetic stuff on Christianity. It was a nice little thing. And I also want to thank Brother Ogawa for having also helped hook that up. And I want to thank Sister Coco also for not only recommending me, but throughout the show, she was making comments in the chat feed and, other encouraging things. And some people had questions. She was answering them just as Brother Ogawa does. Sister Yvette Anderson, glad to see you again. So that was a nice thing. It was kind of an impromptu discussion. Check it out. You'll see what we covered. So check out Black Power Media and check out that show. The last, they weren't in a row, but we had two shows on independent Black schools, the African Children's Advanced Learning Center model. And I consider that to be among the best shows that we've done. And because one, institution building is extremely important, and Black institution building especially. And Blacks coming out of enslavement and free men and women of color, those who had escaped from slavery or however they got out of it, they started this job of institution building. And the first institutions were free African societies, and they were the launching pads for a lot of other institutions. And they basically took care of a diverse range of needs of Black people. And because Blacks are spirit-based, then spirit-based religious institutions were set up. The National Baptists were the first, not the AME. And there's some reasons for that I'll go into later. To Ma'at Jakuta Jackson, greetings. So our ancestors came out with the understanding that they needed power. And secret societies served as the real institutions that launched Black institutions during the enslavement period and immediately after. Almost all of your big institutions, important ones, right after emancipation, were launched by secret societies. And that's a direct continuation of African culture here. I don't like to say carryover, because we have a new African culture formed under an attack in which there was an attempt to wipe the culture out. And we built it on fundamental principles and institutions of Africa, and then added new ones. And then, of course, we've always had to deal with the intrusion of the alien culture coming out of slavery and post-slavery. And that's part of what the sixfold stages to mental freedom is designed to address. But these Africans who are coming out of enslavement and during enslavement, they were the most African among our people. So the institutions they set up had a very strong African, and I should say spirit base, and particularly with the Afrocentric nationalists in particular, they seem to have gone out of the institution building business. In the 70s and the 60s, we had a lot of independent Black schools, some businesses. The Nation of Islam was particularly strong in that. Now the Nation of Islam, their businesses are basically selling newspapers and a few other things, but the business institutional infrastructure that they had then, they don't have now. And most of the so-called Afrocentric Pan-Africanists and nationalists have gone out of it. And that's a big mistake. Issue organizing like Black Lives Matter, that's important. And mobilizing is important. Marches and stuff like that have got us some stuff. But institution building is where stable power is. That is where you can locate programs. It usually requires some place to house it, a building usually. But whether you have it or not, that's how a school operates. And for you to build an institution, you got to pay for it. And then you've got to do a lot of other things, hard work. And most of the people that maintain an institution do it voluntarily. So, and then our weakest area is economic development among conscious people. Now, among the masses of Black people, something like 98% of Black businesses are individually owned by one person. And that's too bad. But the reason is that it's very hard for Blacks to get financing. And so the majority of Black businesses are being financed out of the pockets of their owners. And when they're successful, they usually succeed in employing a family or a few family members. But there's a need for more financing to be put into Black businesses. And we know that Black prosperity is considered to be a threat to white power. I don't use the term white supremacy because they're in decline. I don't know if you've noticed, So these two shows on independent Black schools were important because they grew out of a 51-year-old institution, African Children's Advanced Learning Center. I started it in 72 as chair of Pan-African People's Organization. But the people who have kept it going, you saw two of them, and there are others, they're the ones that have kept it going. Because I was helping build national organizations, I was doing other things. And they went on and dug deep into this. So the things that I was most impressed with, if you watched last week's show, you had some of the former students who are in their 40s now, and one who was in her 20s. And so they were interacting with their two teachers, Ustadi Kadiri and Robert Woods. Ustadi has taught in the school for probably 43 or 44 years, and Robert Woods for 32 years. And they're bad. And so the two things that I found most important about those shows, actually three. One is the way in which African identity has been internalized. It's just a natural thing. And as the young lady said, who's going to my school, my alma mater, San Francisco State, majoring in structural engineering, she said, I didn't know anything else because her mother had it. And there's a whole story to that one. So the natural way in which they dealt with African identity, this is really the biggest success. You see the love in them, the pride in them. A. B. The most important thing about this show, though, was that it illustrated what the African-centered teaching method is, called SEBA. That's what I'm writing a book on. Well, actually, I learned some stuff from what, both the teachers, Ustadi and Robert Woods, put forward. Because I know the method, I use it, but they've refined this method and on every level. And what's impressive is the totality of, their teaching curriculum, which has, of course, a heavy emphasis on what they call our story, which is ancient African and African American history, but on the sciences, on mathematics, and all other subject matters, and on excellence in all of those areas. But the key point is their method. And their method is bringing the light that is within out. And so if you got anything out of this, you should have really been digging deeply at the way in which that was done. What are y'all doing talking about Russia and Ukraine? Focus on this right now. You know what I mean? I might do a show on that later, but come on. So that was really impressive. And then, of course, the 3 former students, impressive, brilliant, and honest. They were telling you what they came out of, because each one had their own little circumstance and situation. And I hope you also noticed that teaching is a 24/7 thing in African Children's Advanced Learning Center. Notice when they were talking about one of the brothers was on the show, they grouped him for a year. They kept him with Ustadi for a year. And Ustadi became his godfather. And the guy said the school saved his life. That's what you have to do now. If you're building an institution, whatever it is, you're going to have to father it and mother it. You just can't set it up. And so some independent Black schools, the teachers have the idea, my only job is to teach. That's bull. The community's been heavily hit. Families are fractured. And so the young people coming in, they need guidance, not just classroom guidance. And sometimes you are helping to parent some parents. Same thing with businesses. If you got somebody coming in who's young, some of them ain't got no work ethic. They may know a skill, but sticking to a job for a particular period of time, that ain't a habit they have. A lot of them ain't seen their daddies do it. They may have seen their mamas do it, but they come in with the idea they can tell you how to run the business and everything else, like Ustadi was saying about the school. You ain't running nothing. You hear me? So institution building is important, but I thought those shows were just magnificent. You should look at them, and we should be working to build independent Black schools. Lao Tzu, good to see you. Ed Donaldson. Lao Tzu's always asking good questions. So, I thought that was extremely important. I want to also note that one of our serious viewers, Lady Kemetic Mosley, I may get her name slightly wrong. Her and her husband have been dedicated viewers of the show. They're both activists in the community. She's been having some serious health problems. And she just sent out a notice that she's going through her 39th operation. And so you need to pray for her. And I've been trying to find her email address. I'll post it and send her a message of encouragement. This is a sister that was in the Navy SEALs, which is the elite corps of the military, and I think she caught some stuff. She caught some stuff. I see Lisa saying some money was returned that she donated. Yeah, we're working on that. I hopefully by this Sunday we'll have that straight. The problem is working some things out with how that works. So send Lady Kemetic Mosley a message, and we'll post where you can send it to. Now, I'm going to be doing something different today. This show is going to be 1 hour, and there's a reason. I've been doing this now about 2 years and about 5 months, and a lot of the shows have been long. When I first started, 3 hours, and then 2.5. Certain shows have to be long, and they will be. But there's also been a request from some of our most dedicated viewers that they would like to have some shorter shows. And today's going to be one of them. So, and if you think that depth has anything to do with length, I know some people who can talk for hours and say nothing, and write big long books that say nothing. You know what I mean? And I've seen some masterpieces that are short and some that are long. So today it's going to be 1 hour. So the topic for today, which is part 2 on this subject, not from last week, but the week before, the topic for today is entitled The Twin-lineal Roots that founded pre-dynastic Kemet and stateless African societies. So this is the topic, and it's an extension of part one, which was entitled Africa, the Birthplace of Democracy, a Central Principle in African American Culture. So I'm covering an area that is little covered by historians. And the overall reason for looking at stateless African societies, which means societies without kings or queens, without structures that are evolved. Generally, they're societies that are lineage based, which are large family units, and or village based. And usually if they're village based, they're also lineage based. And these societies can be fairly large, but most of them are relatively small. But millions of Africans are living in these societies to this day. So to start with, the reason that I focused on this is because I have a systematic view of African history and African world history and world history. I'm not just focusing on Kemet. John Henry Clark and I shared that in common. I didn't get this from him. It's one of the reasons why I apprenticed under him, because we shared that. We had a conversation one day, and he said, for Doc Joseph Ben Yochanan, who was his buddy, and this was not a criticism, he said, for him, Egypt, we would now call it Kemet, was a fetish, meaning that was like his religion. And he wrote a book on that, Africa's Major Gift to World Religions, which is his best book. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's where his heart was. You go where your heart is. But me, I'm a warrior. I come out of battles. And so my awakening comes out of that. And so my approach to history is to apply the past to the present. And it's to use it as a means for creating just societies today, just families, just people, just communities, just economic systems, just family systems. And so I like to dip into a lot of different areas of African culture. And there's an African cultural unity that goes throughout Africa and goes throughout the world. And one culture will give you a better view of some things than another. So I find it a disadvantage to just focus on Kemet for a lot of reasons. One is that there's a lot you can draw from it. It's the greatest achievement in big civilizations, classical civilizations in the world, period, past or present. But there's actually a lot more that you can draw from a lot of these smaller societies and inter-African societies, some of which are highly structured, that you can use today. And they are also integral to African American culture, something that some of us don't think we have, others haven't studied, and then others do. And some confuse with music and think music's your culture, music's your art form. It should be the highest realm of your culture, along with poetry, literature, and other things. Depends on the content, whether or not it is, but it should be. So a central reason for focusing on these societies is there's a lot you can pull out from them that you can use today that also help explain the culture of African Americans today. But in terms of a systematic approach to African and world history, and my 9th book will be on Africa and the world. It'll be showing how the models that come out of Africa transform the whole world. That's my 9th book, and I'm doing research on that now. So the reason for starting this discussion here is because after the hunter-gatherer societies, that's the next set of societies that form. And so when it comes to ancient, they are next to the hunter-gatherer society, the ancient societies and civilizations. They're put down because often they're oral and people are saying, well, give me all the dates and places. But they have an integrity to them because there's a value for truth. And so the oral tradition, which is strong in the in the state societies where you have kings and queens, there's also a great value for the truth, and there's ways for checking it, and especially in these stateless societies, states too, where Jellies, which is a historian in West Africa, was trained at the feet of masters, and they're basically historians trained in lineage, because that's what history is. It's a history of families. When somebody dies, those historians are there gathering everything. When someone is born, and then they're following them throughout their lives. And then in oral societies, all that knowledge was in their heads, you know? And in fact, to be a good historian, good anything, you need to have good memory, but that ain't the whole story, but that's important. So this is the first reason for dealing with these stateless societies, is that they're the next societies to develop after hunter-gatherer. And unlike everyone, just about, maybe other than Dr. Finch, who looks at this, I'm showing you how the stateless societies come out of the cultural foundations laid in hunter-gatherer societies, as well as the state societies that are influenced by the stateless that precedes them in some cases. And then also at the foundation, hunter-gatherer. And so these have been generally ignored in historical commentaries. So that's why the emphasis on stateless societies. The focus today is going to be on how Twin-lineal democracy influenced the stateless societies, with an emphasis on stateless Igbo and Anu Kemetic societies, going back to the beginning of Kemetic societies. And I've done a series on the Anu. Go back and watch them. But what's different from this show and the show 2 weeks ago, where I dealt with Africa, the birthplace of democracy, and was showing you the basic formula that comes out of hunter-gatherer societies, where all the males and females are equally empowered to govern every phase of society. That comes from God. Those aren't my words. And that's the biggest breakthroughs in history, which I framed and called Twin-lineal. And it's the key to almost everything. All great breakthroughs in science, math, history, music, art, literature come from the intuitive plane. You got to know your stuff. You got to have your facts, do your homework, work on it. But just a few get blessed with being able to communicate with God, which spooks a lot of people by me saying it. I don't care. I'm being honest. Einstein, in passing, said theory of relativity came to him in a dream and an intuitive breakthrough. George Washington Carver always said it. He was thinking God's thoughts. He was doing it all the time. That's why he was the greatest scientist in the 20th century, may well be in the 21st. But Africans were doing that for a long time, piping into God's mind. You hear me? So this emphasis today, when it's looking at democracy as being practiced in the stateless societies, coming out of the hunter-gatherer societies, is going to focus on the twin-lineal aspects of democracy. That's my term. Dr. Theophilo Binga said that term should be in the dictionary. He also said I should do a better job of promoting this. And please believe me, I'm trying, because I'm going to keep drilling this through. You may get the point. This is one of the key salvations for African people, African families, African communities, African nations. When I say African, I mean Blacks all over the world. And it's a key for saving anybody that wants to get from insanity to sanity. But it is rooted in our culture, and it has not been seen before. This When God gives you something, you don't come up with anything new in the sense that you invented it. No, God gives you the insight to being able to pipe into God's mind. Notice I didn't say he or she, to see truths that have always been there but haven't been seen before. And this twin-lineal piece has always been there, but it's been confused by terms like matriarchy and patriarchy, matrilineal and patrilineal. You hear me? That's pure confusion. And by the way, the African societies never defined themselves that way. And so why did I come up with the term twin-lineal? Because that formula that God gave me, this comes from God's words, the just societies of Africa. This is me saying that because I'm asking God, what's the basis of the just society? I've been fighting now 63 years for that. And our people have been fighting for that forever, all over the world. And not just us, So I'm asking, what was the basis for the just societies of Africa? I saw this beautiful light. God is a great white light. I said this before, great white light of love and compassion and wisdom. And God's wisdom is so simple and basic. I mean, look at the formula for the theory of relativity. Everybody will say it's simple when it's discovered. It wasn't simple before. And if I got this from my own mind, it would have been so convoluted you wouldn't be able, even though I break stuff down, I'm looking for something complex. It's very simple. In a society made up of males and females, the basis for justice is the balance between them. Huh? And then when God gave it to me, because God's a good speaker, and my stuff is telepathic. I don't hear any words. I just see the light, and the light telepathically is communicating. And God knew I'd get it because God gave it to me on my level. Twa. But nobody had ever figured out that's the basis for Twa justice. Now, there's a lot of other things to it, but that's the basis. But the basis for just societies, period. So twin-lineal is a better term than matrilineal or patrilineal, matriarchy or patriarchy. Why? Because African family systems, and in fact, all family systems are twin. They're not unilineal. They're not one. And so if you're saying patriarchy, which Africans had very few of, matriarchies, very few of, which means rule by men or women, and patriarchy has been about the worst thing the world could have because it is the foundation for oppression. All other archies rest on that. And African systems rule over, we reject that generally. Our philosophies do, everything else. So twin-lineal is a good term because it reflects the twin nature of the family, male and female, masculine and feminine. It also reflects an overriding twin philosophy, which the Dogon are specialists in. That's one of their great contributions, is this notion of twinness, because they're giving you the idea that things like masculine and feminine that have often been treated as opposites in the West, or life and death, or order and disorder, they're twin. You can't have one without the other. And they will refer to them not in the plural, but in the singular, twins, Twin, no S, meaning it's a unity, masculine and feminine. And we know the human being, that's the basic makeup of the human being. So twin-lineal reflects the fact that we're made up of masculine and feminine elements. It's based on the fact that when it comes to inheritance, inheritance goes through both the male and female line, not just the male line or not just the female line. We inherit life, the seed from the father, and the nurturing qualities carried in the womb of the mother. And generally, the masculine is represented by the sun, representing creativity, and the feminine by the moon, representing wisdom, being able to see ahead and behind. And we call that mother wit. That's also a part of the intuitive qualities, and it's the nurturing qualities of the female. But inside the masculine resides the feminine, inside the feminine resides the masculine. And so twin-lineal reflects this. And then the balance of males and females, that is the governance principles and the synthesis of masculine and feminine. Because if you had a balance of masculine and feminine, you'd have sexual androgyny, meaning a person would be equally pulled between both masculine and feminine, wouldn't have a clear definition of their sexual role. That's a part of the meaning of twin-lineal. And my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, here it is, defines that. In fact, in the beginning, I have a table of definitions, and that's one of them. And so this twin-lineal piece, baby, let me tell you, this is the key. It's the key. It comes from God, and it fits. I'm going through any society or anything, it's going to come up, African societies, and even in spite of slavery and colonialism. So this is part of the reason. And today I'm going to be focusing on, in the Igbo societies, how the society is organized in the Igbo societies, and they make up a very strong element of people from Africa that came to the United States and the Western Hemisphere. So I'm going to be looking at the way in which the male, female, masculine, feminine principle operates in their societies. So instead of just generalizing, I wanted to be specific. And I'm going beyond what I covered in the mother principle. I don't repeat the stuff that I've written, but you should read the books, because the books go into a lot more depth than I can go into a show. And some people are too lazy to read a book. Well, you might be too lazy to live, because I'm telling you that if you're going to lead, you better read. And everybody in this age got to be a leader of some kind. You got to know what's going on around you. You got to be able to prepare your children for this world, and reading is a part of it. So this is at the core of what I'll be discussing when I look at the Igbo and the ancient Kemetic systems. It's the twin-lineal model that is really the basis for some of the most important contributions that come out of these societies. And the connection between twin-linealism and democracy should be obvious, because it's the empowerment, equal empowerment of males and females, and that's the basis for democracy. That is what democracy is. When they're all involved in making, all the males and females are involved in making those decisions. And some people on this show know this. Lao Tzu is one that does. African democracy is a consensus democracy. That means everybody has a say-so. And you might think, well, that's impossible to do. I've explained that the San Francisco Freedom Movement was basically based on that consensus, meaning policy was always made through consensus. And that means that you get your best ideas that way. You also get everybody to buy in, and you're not going to have people trying to tear down your decision. And also, democracy is defined as majority vote. That's the will of one group over another. There's some times where you have to do that because you're in a society where there's disruptive influences and you just may have to go to majority vote when you really know you're right. But wherever you can, you want to go for the consensus. And in the last show, I was stressing the fact that it's generally not known Africa is the birthplace of real democracy. What you're calling the European view, which is that democracy begins under Solon, Solon, reforms in Athens. First of all, Solon's reforms, that which they call democratic, was a lot system whereby lot they picked some people who could be electors, but they had to elect the powerful to those positions, which is pretty much the way Republican government has worked here. That in the beginning, property owners, male, a handful, no women, which was true in the Greek system as well, because they didn't like women, you know. They thought heaven was a state of existence before women. How could you have life before women or men? What kind of stuff are you talking? And, and then later Pericles comes in with more thorough reform. But most of Europe didn't practice any democracy. That's hypocrisy. For the African, it's a part of the constitution of our people. I'm not just talking written constitution. I'm talking about the insides. We got to have a say-so. It's bred into you by 149,000 years of hunter-gatherer society and thousands of years of agrarian societies. And even when you had kingly societies at the village level, the people ruled, and that's why their economies were successful. Trying to see what you got up here. Okay, so I want to see if there's something for me to react to right now. Let me go up here and see if there is. Okay. Wolf Manlu, the Twa's societal structure being twin-lineal balanced every community on this planet. Yes, and that's what my 9th book is going to go through. Yeah. He also says this societal living like the Twa gives us facts about a harmonious existence where we recognize family in every Black face we saw regardless of region. Yeah, that's true. And it's drugs that have undermined that one, but we have to bring it back and strengthen it. And that's what carried us through enslavement. So twin-linealism is significant as a basis for democracy, since it's male-female empowerment. And that's basically what democracy should be, not some systems of so-called representative government where you elect somebody and then they do the will of somebody else other than you, because they are the ones that nominated them in the first place, the owners of the country. Imagine somebody owning a country. Well, there are a few people that own this country. And then, of course, this is a model for the world. And so this is good for everybody, but it's your culture. So the role of stateless societies isn't just in West Africa or other parts of Africa. It's also in North Africa. And one of the values for looking at stateless societies is that it's the root and origin flowing out of hunter-gatherer societies of civilization. Hunter-gatherers are the first civilization, and all civilizations come out of them. But then after that, these stateless societies. And so I did a series on what I call the period of the great ones, ancient Kemet, which I don't call pre-dynastic because it is a wrong term. It suggests that prior to 31 or 3200 BC, which most of our historians study, there were no dynasties, when in fact, the dynastic Kemets of the 3200 BC period acknowledge first dynasty was with Asar, and they also realized he was a real person. And I date that back to the Shu-Tefnut period. I went through a lot of stuff. Go look at the series on that. Now, this was a stateless period from 10,000 BC up to Asar. That was stateless period. They didn't have kings and queens. Huh? This is the real key point. And what's important about this? It's the period where all the elements of Kemetic civilization was created. Uh-oh. See, we are into bigness. So these societies ain't that big, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? Why should we study them? Oh, they didn't have writing, blah, blah, blah. And I'm sure in the beginning, the Kemites didn't either. They innovated writing during this period preceding dynasties, during the period of the great ones. And so historians acknowledge that by the so-called first dynasty, 3100 or 3200 BC, Kemet is in decline, meaning it's no longer the creative civilization that it was in its beginning, because all the elements were created before then. So get this straight. And so why is it that the stateless period could be so creative? First, because we now know who these Anu people were, and they're on the promotional leaflet for this show. We got one here. These little people here, they're the first people in Kemet. They're also the founders of the dynastic system, and that was Asar, who was one of them. You see, that's a Twa person. Somebody I kept talking to, they said, they're the Twa? Yeah, they're the Twa. Huh? And so if you know the Twa, you'll know some of the things that was going on then. And I presented a lot of anthropological stuff on pottery and various carvings and stuff that come out of this period. Go back and look at those shows. And so what's characteristic then of this period? It's a twin-lineal period where males and females are interacting. And it's a peaceful period largely because all the data that I have on pre-dynastic Kemet, very little evidence of weaponry or of warfare. And that provides conditions for creating civilization, peacefulness. But one of the reasons why the stateless society could give rise to creative expression is this twin-lineal thing, the interaction of males and females freely with no unjust constraints on them. But the main reason was they didn't have a state. And don't get me wrong, states have their value. You know, it gives you some power and stuff, but state by definition in the Western sense means instruments of oppression, the military, the police, and all of this. Now, in African societies, we had what's called states without militaries. So that's a difference. And usually when they come, it's when warfare comes to those societies. But still, when you have a centralized system, there are some restraints on people. And so in this pre-dynastic period, this period before the dynasty of Asar and Aset, no restraints. No restraints, creativity, And that is the nature also of the stateless, classless, age-race societies that we find throughout Africa. Look at the Dogon. They're stateless. Now, they are not the ancient stateless because they had retreated from Mali under Sunjata. They didn't want to be Muslims, so they go into this mountainous area of the Bangaderia Cliffs in Mali. But what do? They innovate the most advanced system of astrophysics in the world. Dr. Finch says, and I agree with him, that their astrophysics was in many ways more advanced than Kemet's, and Kemet's was advanced, And the Kemites did the same thing because their greatest innovations in astrophysics occurred during this stateless period. And I went through this before on the Giza area. They have these stone hinges that go back 16,500 BC that mark the rotation of Orion. And that's probably, that date is probably older than the time in which the Anu were in Kemet. We can date them in 10,000. Maybe it was earlier. It's unlikely it was 16,500 because that's at the very beginning of the agricultural cycle. But whether it was or was not the case, they were innovating on astrophysics, which means there's a whole lot of stuff you got to know astrophysics. And Kemet is a great sky watching place. The sky's very clear. You can see the stars and everything else. The stateless society creates conditions where people can delve into things and create things. And in the case of the people, the Dogon people, they do have a priestly system. So there's a structure there. And those priests are the ones who are the master astrophysicists, as well as healers, priests, many other things. And they're very highly evolved human beings. So there is some structure there. Not all stateless societies are just villages made up of villages and lineages. Some of them also have other structures. And this is one example. But again, this is one of the reasons that the Dogon could be so creative. And their philosophy is basically a twin philosophy that arises out of a male-female based society of equal empowerment. Now, what's also interesting, if you're going to look at stateless societies, the African in America is in America, but not of it. Our ethos is creativity by necessity, not because we were a special group of Africans that came here more creative than any others. Because as some people say, the only difference between the African and the Caribbean or South America and the African and America, United States, is that they just dropped us off in different places. But then different things happen in those different places. In the Caribbean, very similar things. In the United States, very similar, brutal slavery. But what was different was a successful settler colony coming into being based on the genocide of Native Americans. And so the attack on our culture brought out the necessity for us to fight to recreate it, where it was just dropped in the Caribbean and continued, But one of the reasons why we could be so creative is we didn't have any loyalty to this system. This system's oppressing us. You hear me? We're in it, but not of it. Those of us brainwashed to identify with it, we're the least creative. But those of us who realize that this system ain't working for us, we see outside of it and beyond it. That's why Carter G. Woodson in Miseducation of the Negro located the most creative Blacks as the one who were least messed with in the head, meaning had less formal education. Because now if you do get a formal education, you have to undergo a transformation of the miseducation, you know? So the African in America, one of the things that contributed to our creativity is that we're in this country, but not of it. And we are free. And that's what really the African Centered Project, the Pan-African Nationalists and other projects is it's bringing the best of Africa into your reality. And if you re-Africanized yourself, you're in a better position to do it, you know? So this is another reason. Now, I want to look at the Igbo case of African stateless societies. Not all Igbo societies were stateless. Some had kings and queens, but a majority of them were stateless. And what's important about the Igbo society is the interplay between males and females and masculine and feminine principles in the operation of their lineages, their villages, and their society at large. And so, as I pointed out in the mother principle, the Igbo, the Afrikbo Igbo, are a people that are called twin unilineal, meaning they have lines of descent of the, of what's called the male line and the female line. The anthropologists want to call it the patrilineal and matrilineal line. It's actually twin lineal, and it's an expression of true twin linealism. And so among the Afrikbo Igbo, men inherit through the lines of their fathers and their male relatives, grandparents. Females inherit through the line of their mothers. And so this is twin unilineal. Whereas just twinness is a little different because it's each one is tied to the lineage, of masculine or feminine, or matrilineage or patrilineage, which is twin lineal. That shares common features with, say, Yoruba, where in the Yoruba system, a child's last name comes from the father, but inheritance goes through a male-female system, much like twin unilineal, though they're not twin unilineal. So in the case of the Yoruba, a male child inherits from the father. And in Yoruba, the exception. In the Yoruba, the males are farmers. So males inherit the use of land. Nobody owns land in traditional societies because inheritance follows responsibility. And the females, and since the male is the farmer, then the male who inherits from their father is going to work that same land. So they inherit what they're responsible for. And it's the same thing with the females. So they're in charge of the marketplace, all the things they make and what they sell. And their husbands have to put them in business. And all the profit they make is theirs. So this is a common feature that we find in all traditional African family systems. And so in the case of twin unilineal, it's distinct because there's a line of the males, a line of the females, what they call matrilineage and patrilineage. So there's a lineage system that females belong to, a lineage system that males belong to. But what's key is the reason why using patrilineal, matrilineal isn't any good, and matriarchy, patriarchy hardly ever exists, is because twinness is what is characterizing these systems. Twinness, that is male, female, masculine, feminine. And so in the family line and in the village line. So in the case of Afrikbo Igbo, in terms of work, there's work that women do work that men do. It is complementary. So each plays a role in house building. They each have a particular set of functions. One of the things that's interesting about Igbo, and one of the reasons why I'm using them as an example, is that they reflect what happened when societies transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural. And so they're embracing agriculture. But what's interesting is, in most of Africa, because in the hunter-gatherer stage, women were the gatherers of wild, edible things in the forest or in the desert or wherever. They become the innovators of agriculture. So overwhelmingly, African women are the agriculturalists. But in societies like Igbo, Igbo and others, some others, men and women are agriculturalists. This is interesting. There's a lot of heavy work in agriculture, and so it's being spread between men and women. And so, again, in division of labor, there are men's crops and women's crops. Under colonialism, the men's crops got favored over the women's. That is the yam crop, because it could be sold outside of the village and it could be exported for foreign exchange. And so that favored the male over the female. But the fact is, there are domains that each one rules. And it again is based on this principle of male-female equal empowerment. And so if you go to the village association, what you'll find is there's a part of the village association that is controlled exclusively by women. And then there's a men's association controlled by men. The women who are in charge of the women's association, and this is true in the societies without kings and queens, they'll use the term that the head of the women's association is called the female king. And she plays a primary role in spirit affairs, sacrifices, and other things. She chairs women's meetings and governs issues especially that affect women. Y'all get this? This is no patriarchy, you know? So she speaks for the Women's Association, and when farming is going to happen, she's the one that issues the orders that now it's time to farm. Now, under the Igbo and Igbo system, men and women can pass on land. Notice I didn't say they own it. But the twin-lineal aspect that inclines towards women, they have more land than the men. And we know in ancient Kemet, it was the woman that was in charge of the land. And a man could get to be prosperous being married to a prosperous farming woman, but when she died, that access to the land passed to her daughter, not to her husband. Huh? And power in Kemet derived from these women who controlled the land. And so I pointed out, I'm one of the first historians to point this out, it was the Shepsuts that the term Hatshepsut, who was the 18th dynasty queen or, you know, ruler of Kemet, because they didn't really have queens. That's where she gets her title from. Shepsut. These were the prosperous women who were farmers. And they gave their input to the pharaoh. This is at the point you're no longer stateless. But for a period of time, and I pointed this out in a previous show, they actually picked the pharaohs. That, again, is twin-lineal. You don't know what you're dealing with unless you got this male-female thing going on there, you know? And you find that same interplay throughout African state societies where among the Akan, women make up a part of the king's council. They nominate the candidate to be king. And among the Yoruba, you have the eldest, wisest male and female who nominate the candidate to be Oba, king. And so it's again a male-female interplay. In this case, indirect. Not all the people having the say-so there, but they're coming out of lineages where those lineages represent all the males and females in the lineage, and decisions are made by consensus. Now, in the Igbo system, where the males and females each have their own decision-making over the market and other decisions, the female head, she's the one that determines when the agricultural work begins. But in the case of the men's association, they don't determine that directly. It's the younger men that do that. So it's got to go through them. The ritual superiority is in the hands of women. Ritual superiority, what does that mean? That means the people who preside over spirit functions, when you're making sacrifices, when you're mediating with the ancestral spirits and stuff like that. It's the females that have the greatest power in doing that. And if you remember the series when I went into how the Twa civilized Niger-Congo Bantu people, the most important thing that the Twa gave to the Niger-Congo Bantu people was the ability to contact ancestors. That was the most important thing, And that was important because it's the ancestors that will determine whether or not you'll be prosperous. And they went to the Twa because they were the first ancestors. And I've gone through this before. If you go through the previous show, see, a lot of this research I'm doing, it's laying the foundation for this 9th book. But there's stuff you ain't going to get. If you think I'm giving you all of it, you'll get it when it's written. But this is a big project. That's what usually happens. When I'm finishing one, I'm getting ready to work on a couple of more. The next one will be the San Francisco Freedom Movement. And then this Africans and world history. So ritual superiority is very important, meaning that women have the greatest power when it comes to contacting ancestral forces, particularly female ancestral forces, which are the most powerful. So this is extremely important. And she does this through the matrilineage. The male in the patrilineage is dealing more with the political matters of seeing that property is allocated fairly, even though the women have access to more of it than the men, and seeing that disputes are settled. So that those are some of the kind of things that they're doing. What I'm doing is giving you how this works, So the female matrilineage head, who's called female king, therefore handles the sacred pots. Now, I showed you when I was dealing with the founding of Kemet, all of these different pots that have been, made in the ancient period, some going back 8,000, 9,000 years. We think of pots as just something where you're going to keep food. No, their main role is to carry sacrificial offerings. And it may well be that the practice that we had in enslavement, where we put our heads under a pot, came from this tradition where these pots are sacred. Because basically that's called the hush harbor, where blacks would retreat to the furthest removed secret spot in the plantation to put their heads under a bucket to bring down the spirit. The pots are where, the offerings to the spirits are made. And that's true throughout Africa. So when you're looking at pottery, you're not looking at it from the from the European framework. This is just art. Oh, isn't it pretty? This is where you put some plants. These are sacrifices, baby. This is spirit stuff. Everything that you call art in Africa serves a spirit function. Everything. In traditional society, and still does at the village level in Africa today. So the spirit focus is extremely important, and the female is key to it. Now, in the system we're looking at with the Afripo Igbo and Igbo in general, and this is true generally throughout African societies, whether they be matrifocal, meaning where you're focusing primarily on the woman, or patrifocal, more on the man. The closest relationship that a child is going to have is with their mother and with female relatives. And they call this the relationship of the womb. And so even, a child in a twin-lineal system, which is twin unilineal, is a male child is going to inherit from the father, but they come from the womb of the mother. The closest ties are going to be with the mother. She's the one that raises you. And so the closest ties and relationships are going to be between kins of the same womb. You hear me? So again, mother power, which is very important. So these are some of the key things in terms of how twin-lineal works in a twin unilineal system, pretty much the same way. And what's happening here is there's a division so that men and women are agriculturalists. Now, in addition, women have their markets and they sell their goods, men have theirs, and men are hunters and they tend cattle. And in case of war, when you're past the peaceful period, they're the warriors, they're the fighters, and they travel, usually after they've been initiated, which is sometime after. So this is a key thing in terms of the Igbo people, in terms of how their system works. Now, one of the key things that happens when you have the movement from hunter-gatherer to the agrarian democracy, twin-lineal democracy, is these early societies, many of them incline more towards the female in the beginning. And I gave that example when I was looking at the way in which the Twa civilized Niger-Congo Bantu people. These were small agrarian societies that were kind of wild, kind of like what Asar faced in Kemet with some of the bigger Africans who came in later. And so they're civilizing them. But who's the leaders in those societies? Women. But it's a male-female empowerment thing. They're not imposing their power, but the society is inclining towards them. And one of the key indications of this is the role of the African goddess in Igbo stateless societies and in Kemetic pre-dynastic and dynastic systems. And so there's a direct correlation between the goddess figures that we find in the Igbo and what we find in Kemet. Hather, for example, is a very important goddess figure in Kemet. And she's the goddess of music. And the cow is her animal. and she's associated with the sycamore tree. Now, of course, someone's saying that, Wolf Manlu, Set has the throne on her head because she's the source of royal authority. But among the Igbo, you have the centrality of the goddess figure is very important. And it traces back to the early origin of the stateless democratic societies. And so a very important goddess for the Igbo, found especially among the Nobi people, Nnobi, Nobi people, is the goddess Adameli, spelled Idemili. Using African vowels, that would be Adameli. She is the central goddess. She's the goddess that comes out of water. And I'm going to get into something in a minute on this. All over Igbo land, particularly among the Nnobi, you find figures of the goddess Adameli. But there's only one time a year where they do general ancestral veneration, male and female ancestors. But it is the goddess Adameli who is overpowering, all important, coming out of water. And we're going to see how this ties into African American culture in a minute. Adameli represents the indigenous spirit system that some people would incorrectly call the indigenous religion. She's the source of that. And she is addressed with titles, very powerful titles. So these are the titles that are used to address her. Oko Inyamwe, the Great Lady. Ize Nyanyi, female king. Now understand, these are in societies in which you don't have kings and queens, and in some they do. Adameli Ogalanya Nagata. It pictures her with a huge bag of riches because you see, God is supposed to promote your prosperity. It's a key point. I'm into Ifa. You understand? Health, wealth, and happiness. Those are the key points of traditional African spirituality. You're going to the spirits to be prosperous. She is also called Inyuanyi Odu Opwa, a woman wearing ivory anklets. Notice in the ancient period of Kemet, ivory was used for the natural comb, which could only be soul sisters and soul brothers, and all other kinds of ornaments. And this is going back 9,000 BC. She is also called Ize Onyili Imba, the unconquerable one. And she's also referred to as old woman. Old woman. So this is a woman of great power. She's a woman that represents prosperity and success in life. She's the maternal force in the society. The priest of Adameli is held in high regard. It happens to be a man. He is not allowed to wear pants. He wears a dress in respect for her. Don't get anything wrong with this. And his wife is also held in high regard. And again, in African systems, the symbol for, or the carvings, the statues for the goddess Adameli are tended to by the priest. And this is called um, cultivation. In this society, a cult is some place that you're blindly following. But in African traditional systems, the symbol, in this case, it would be a carving of the goddess Ademeli, has to be fed. That means cultivated. So generally providing offerings for it. And that's done daily by the priest. And then once a year, the whole village comes out and the goddess is worshipped in the village. This was done in Kemet. This was done among the Yorubas. This is done all over Africa. And how do they worship the goddess? Or in some cases, God? Praise prose, the same stuff that happens in the Black church. Singing, dancing, drumming, and lifting up praise to God. Something that our ancestors would not give up as they embraced so-called Christianity on our terms after enslavement. Your reading of Black Christianity is usually wrong because you think the slave master shoved it down our throat. We were too spirit-based to have anything shoved down our throat. We picked this up on our own terms when it was in our own interest. So she has her own holy day where the Igbo people come out, as they do in other parts of Africa, to worship her and show her respect. And her main roles are what? To ward off death, which means give you a long life. And by the way, that's the role of my Babala. He's kept me alive. I don't have time to go into that. And so to ward off sickness and death so you can live a long life. Sacrifices are made to her so that people will be prosperous and so that they will be protected. And so she's the maternal principle of nurturing, caring, and love. And this is one of the legacies that when you form these classless democratic societies, spirit is real key. And the woman is central to this. Now, in the period that I covered, the history I covered on ancient Kemet, you saw in the some of the carvings of the Venus figure, big butt woman, that is a goddess symbol. And you find that all over in the carvings of ancient Kemet, and you find that all over Africa, but it stems from the Kung people, the Venus woman. And she is the goddess symbol of spirit power. She is held in high reverence. And this is also connected to the worship of the goddess among the Igbo people and other African people as well. Now, Africans carry these traditions into the Americas. I'm wrapping up. I went 23 minutes over my time. I know you all long listeners are real happy. I'm trying to get to 1 hour. So among the groups that travel, that is, are forced to come to America and the Caribbean and South America and the diaspora, among them are the Igbos, but it's Yoruba, it's Asante, very few Dogon because they're in inhospitable regions, hard to get to, Bambara, many others. They all share this twin-lineal quality, but I'm focusing on this one for today. So what you have then is a continuation of the twin-lineal tradition in America. So the Igbo is real key in this. And I pointed out before, they were called the Flying Africans because they would commit suicide rather than remain slaves. And they would go to the water to do that. So I'm going to play a little thing by the Fifth Jubilee Singers on Wade in the Water. Now, I'm going to say this. This ain't my favorite version because the Fifth Jubilee Singers do what Zora Neale Hurston called neo-spirituals. I call it operatic spirituals, conforming more to white standards, you know. But we couldn't find a good gospel rendition of this show on this show. But the song, wade in the water, children, God's going to trouble the water. This is the Igbo song of wading in the water, where the spirit of Adameli was. And when you drown, it's going to take you back to Africa. And so this is
children, wade in the water. God's not gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's not gonna trouble the water. See that monster dressed in trouble. God's gonna trouble the water. God's gonna trouble. God's gonna trouble. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. God's gonna trouble the water. Step in the water was cold. God's gonna trouble the water. It's gonna trouble, but not my soul. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. If you don't believe I've been redeemed, God's gonna trouble the water. I'll just slowly down to Jordan Street. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. God's gonna trouble the water. God's gonna trouble the water.
So why were these Africans wading in the water? And why was it that God was going to trouble the waters? Because carrying this twin-lineal democratic tradition into the Americas, the African refused to accept the authority of so-called slave masters. They resisted it. They resented it. They opposed it in many different ways. You know what I mean? They would break plows. They would injure animals. They would poison their masters when they could get away with it. They would escape. They would plan rebellions. And the most rebellious of the group were the Igbos, because the Igbos came out of these societies that were thoroughgoingly twin-lineal, male and female, equal empowerment. And they resented anyone telling them to do anything. That is true for Africans coming from all of these societies, but true as for them. And so this idea of having a say-so in your life, I pointed this out before. The Igbo are so democratic that when they're picking their destiny in heaven, they quarrel with God, according to them. You know what I mean? So, but this was the democratic spirit of resistance, this continuation of twin-linealism, because it's one of the most persistent features of African culture, previously not known in, among all features of African culture, because it is the key to maintaining your humanity. I saw Wolf Menlo in a point earlier making the point that, you need this masculine, feminine synthesis to have this. And sometimes under the most cruel circumstances, it brought out some of the greatest sense of humanity. That's why we could create an art form in enslavement. Who does that? A distinctly new African, but African-based art form founded on the spiritual blues to bring beauty out of ugliness. Who does that? You hear me? That's the spirit that this twin-lineal legacy maintains, which is the spirit of your humanity. Quit saying they dehumanized us in slavery. Very few of us were dehumanized. Just because they put you under dehumanized conditions doesn't mean you're dehumanized. You hear me? It's the ones who did it that are dehumanized. The ones who did it that are savages, barbarians. You hear me? So this twin-lineal legacy was at the heart of the drive for freedom for the new African, for the African in the Caribbean, wherever the African was. But in this country, this was key to that. And democracy, male, female, equal empowerment, democracy was the key to the creation of this culture. It wasn't created by any single individual. This was a collective creation, which, as the artist will point out, gifted individuals may have composed some lyrics, but it was the enslaved community, and after that, the so-called free community, that would accept it or reject it. And these conventions that this art form were based on were African. Now, when I was referring to the Fifth Jubilee singers, saw a comment, yeah, beautiful harmony. Yeah, but you see, spiritual blues, which is what the spirituals are, or gospel blues, or the blues, is ragged harmony. It's not a straight sound the way it is in operatic music. And that is your African legacy, because it reflects the zigzags and ups and downs of life. But the Fifth Jubilee singers, who are great singers, and their stuff is pretty, but it's in a Western way. The first teacher that taught them, and the first singers were, former enslaved. So they would sing the real spirituals. He put them in a closet to get them to get their enunciation so it was white. And of course, it was the Fifth Jubilee singers that saved Fisk University, because they traveled in Europe and made a lot of money. So I'm just making that point. But the key point is, so the Igbo spirit is a part of the general spirit brought from Africa to the Americas. And we see this twin-lineal spirit in the strength of the family. And it was the cooperation of men and women, African men and women, who, against all odds, for over 100 years maintained two-parent households where 75% of them had a man and woman in it. And now it's 29% because of the hit of drugs and globalization on Black communities, which I've gone into before. We'll cover again. White families have been reduced from 75% to 50% because no finance, no romance. The forces that have hit Black communities since 68 have done more devastation to the Black family than slavery did. A lot of us will say, well, we couldn't marry in slavery. You mean you couldn't have a legal marriage? But Black people picked their mates. And of course, free men and women of color could have it legal. But the fact is, enslavers couldn't generally control that. And the extended family community was the socializing unit of the Black community. Again, a twin-lineal institution. One of the key things that I think is very important when you're looking at the sacred role of the woman, both in hunter-gatherer and in the agrarian democracies, is the role of Big Mama. John Henry Clark called this Big Mama-ism. You know what I mean? And he knew about that because the women, the people who really shaped him, Big Mamas. His grandmother, who told him about his great grandfather, Buck. That was a good name because he bucked the system. That was her husband. And that was his first interest in Africa. It came from Big Mama. John said when she tells the stories of Africa and there was disagreement or the Civil War, she said she saw the eyes of Sherman, and someone would say, you didn't see the eyes of Sherman. That ain't true. She'd take her little walking stick and, knock it on the ground. Authority has spoke. In my family, Big Mama was my great-grandmother, Sylvia Brown, 6 foot, ramrod straight. They called her a wampus cat. I've mentioned this in some shows before. My mother was asking me, what did wampus cat mean? I said it meant wild. It meant she could kick a man's behind. It meant you don't play with her. And she was the moral authority. She was the protector because at least when my mother and her brother were being raised, she was doing the raising. And at that point, their father, my grandmother, had divorced before they were born. And so she was playing both roles. And my grandmother was working. So my great-grandmother took care of the children. But she instilled the moral values. And you know how they instilled it. In the Caribbean, they call it heavy manners, on your behind. So Big Mama-ism is an important institution in the Black community. Elder Black women, many of whom are holding up our communities today. When sometimes the daughters have been infected with drug addiction or have other problems, it's the Big Mama, in this case, the grandmother, who is filling in and holding things together. This is an institution that comes out of the centrality of African women in the twin-lineal system, where it's a male-female thing, but inclines towards the female. So, and then in resistance traditions, I've said to Agawa many times, and I've said to y'all, many of you don't even know what a victory is because you don't celebrate them when you have them, and you don't talk about the groups that produce them, except the dead ones who have, you have a holiday for. But if you, and so I was looking at when I was on the Black Power program on Easter, someone asked the question. I didn't see it because I couldn't see the chats when I was being interviewed, but later I went back and looked at the show, and the sister said, what would power look like under these circumstances? That's an interesting question because we shouldn't be asking it, because you should know how you wielded power, where your victories were, and how they were achieved. But because of enslavement, a lot of us have this idea that we can't win. And when we have a victory, we'll find fault with it. Or some of us think we got to be totally free to, do anything. Some of us think the paycheck's going to be freedom. Like hell, even if you got your reparations, that ain't freedom. Freedom don't come through dead presidents. It comes in other ways. And one of the key expressions of twin-lineal empowerment among our people have been the movements that we have put forward. These are movements of males and females. During certain periods, like the Black Freedom Movement, men had too much say-so. And now, during the period of Black Lives Matter, it's the other way around. The sisters have got more say-so, and they should, because communities are broken. Sisters are playing a major role in taking care of families. They're playing both the father and the mother. Some of them doing a good job. Others trying, against real difficult circumstances. So the twin-lineal aspect of our culture is there. We need to raise it up. We need to appreciate it. We need to know what it is. So in conclusion, let's see, this took an hour and 41 minutes over. In conclusion, twin-linealism was a foundation of the just societies of the hunter-gatherers, starting with the Coon coming out of South Africa. And among all Twa, it was then inherited by the classless, democratic, twin-lineal-based societies and served as the foundation for creating the civilization of ancient Kemetic. And it is the basis for revitalizing African people, families, and communities, and in the globe, nations and villages. So this is a great legacy you have. You need to study it, and I would suggest you need to check this book out. Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. Go to Gumroad, click in underneath the description of this show. Dr. Obenga, Theophil Obenga, describes this book as a classic, and he says that the term twin-lineal should be in the dictionary. I just barely touched the surface of what this system is, but it's basically in a society of males and females, you should be the ones running it. Basic. But it's also saying inside of us, we should be working on mastering the forces within. So the masculine and feminine are synthesized. And this is how I got to it, because I was good at the masculine, but not good at the feminine. And so I went through life crisis on this, as a lot of males need to. So this is really the key, because it's a spiritual thing. It's not just a governance thing. And it's about your spirit, making you balanced, so you can strive to be the best human being you can be. Hotep, hope you got something out of that. Let's see if there's any comments here. M. Jewel, let me see what you have to say here. I'm going to have to share that with the ADOS community. Freedom doesn't come through dead presidents. I'm sure some will chase me far away. Now, don't get me wrong, nothing wrong with having some. But if you think, look, at a lot of Jews in Germany had dead marks, and they got marked. They even took the gold out of their teeth. That didn't keep them free, Let's see. Yeah, Nahia Ninti, greetings to you. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe to the show. Was wondering why I had never heard that term twin-lineal before today. Because when I published the book, I published it myself And I had a strategy, but it didn't work, in terms of getting it to a real mass audience. And I did sell quite a few books, but not as many as required to hit a mass audience. And so I'm still working on that. And at the same time that my book came out, Marimbani's book, Urugu, came out. And overall, I've sold as many as she has, but hers hit the scene and reached a larger group of Black people earlier than mine because she had a publisher that had a good distribution network. I have a distribution network, but my publicizing, that strategy didn't work. So I'm working on others to get that out there. You need to share that. Let's see. I'm glad you like that Twin-lineal. Let's see what else we have here. Ancient African Mindset. Thanks for the comments, sir. Now, Wolf Manlu, Baba, can you speak on how WAS's doing an American tour, especially in the light of what military secrets which have just been exposed about Egypt giving Russia arms? I don't know what you're talking about, Hawass. What is that? Explain that. And then I'll come back to that. Let me see here. Yeah, good question. I was supposed to discuss that here, and I didn't. Could I speak more on the brothers from Tennessee? Yeah, the two brothers, Justin Jones and Justin Pearson, who stood up in the Tennessee legislature and supported those calling for restricting guns in this country, and particularly the deadly ones, and had just, supported a protest in the Tennessee legislature over the murder of some young people recently. What I'd say is that that's an expression of African democracy, and they took it the way they're supposed to, because the Tennessee legislature has been gerrymandered. That legislature should be nearly 50-50 Democrat and Republican, but it's been gerrymandered to the point that it's largely Republican, right wing. And so those that wanted to criticize the two Justins for, and a white woman who joined them for supporting restrictions on the use of guns and showing some sympathy for people who have lost their lives, they were put out because they were expressing their right to free speech. And they were doing it outside of the decorum of a bunch of lynchers who could quietly talk about hanging you. And so they wanted them to be quiet and shut up. And so they turned, along with other demonstrators that came to the Tennessee legislature, they turned this into a demonstration. And so they didn't like the decorum. But if someone had been demonstrating for Donald Trump, they would have had no problem, So these are some young men who are standing on principle, and they're again expressing this same urge to freely express themselves, which is a part of our culture. And some brilliant young men as well, So any questions here? Wolf Manley talking about getting hit upside his head by his grandmother. Yeah, some big mamas have inherited the legacy of slavery. You would think that the thing that the African resented most was a whipping or any kind of torture. That'd be the last thing that we would use. But some of us seem to think that it produced results. And so it is one thing that we need to take out of our toolbox when it comes to raising children. There are other ways to, discipline children. The main thing is to instill self-discipline. M. Jewell. So I wonder if those Africans in Cuba were of a group who understood this process, where they refused to become slaves and walked into the water to return home. Probably. And then other Africans as well. They had that same spirit, Wolf Manley, our ancestors prophesied that the goddess principle would return after Sekhmet cleansed the world. Look around you, family. Yeah. Talking about the role of kinship. Kurt Thomas, did the Twa realize that the further they removed themselves from nature, the more alienated they became towards each other, unbalanced? Perhaps that's why they removed themselves from Kemet. I guess you're referring to the period in which they innovate agriculture and then decide to create the Kemetic civilization. They have a saying that they built this civilization called Kemet, and then after a while they tired of it and walked away from it. So on the one hand, they created a society that had a lot of harmony with nature. The fact that they grounded it in Ma'at, harmony, truth, justice, right order, saw this as the direction of heaven and earth. So there was that. When they moved to a centralized society, they had to have had reasons. But that would also bring in problems. And the centralized society, to the extent as you go through the 3100 BC on period, to the extent that power gets accumulated in fewer hands, this is one of the things that creates the basis for oppression. So you have a period where some of these pharaohs got greedy, Some people don't like to talk about that. Probably, as one of my shows, I pointed out that Twa, wise person, said that in building this civilization, they found they weren't happy. That happiness comes from bringing an antelope home and putting a smile on your wife's face. Happiness comes from the happiness that your children and your family has. Happiness comes from living in a society where there's tranquility and where people can pursue their dreams to the maximum, So, that may be part of it. Lao Tzu. Question: is democracy individual-centered or group-centered? In the consensus model, can the minority stop the majority from moving forward? I've managed this model, so it's not as hard as people think, because people think, well, one person can stop it. it's group centered, but everybody in it, each person is in it. And so each person has got their own will to express within the context of a group decision. And the good thing about consensus, and I've learned this through, you know, chairing this consensus process, is everybody gets a say so. And then what happens is the best ideas come forward. And then it's a matter of time, because to develop consensus takes patience. It takes a willingness to listen. John and Clark would stress to me the respect for elders. But elders are not the ones that make the final decision. So in African systems, the elder would bring in a recommendation, but the people would discuss it. And sometimes the discussion wouldn't start with elders either, you know. So it's the group. You know, you're looking at the well-being of the group, all the males and females in that particular situation. Now, in modern times, there are times where the consensus model will not work, because if, say, the government has sent in agents to disrupt your group, they're going to tie it up. Or if you just got plain confusion and the people who are pushing positions are pushing it for any number of reasons, but not necessarily correct, then sometimes you'll have to go for a majority. But in that case, when you do it, it's usually overwhelming majority, you know, it's overwhelming. And sometimes you'll have to set aside a decision and wait until later, depending on its importance and how many people are opposed to it. M. Jewell, Africans here in the early years during the many townships being built are those times of being stateless. Well, these are organized systems, just as the stateless systems were. And they took courage to do, because Blacks were building independent cities surrounded by white cities that were, you know, trying to run terror and stuff, and finding free space. And so they had an order that they set up. Usually it's somebody who initiated it. There are people who put up money, people who pool money. But it is under stateless circumstances, in that we had to build these cities because we didn't get anything out of the white cities. And those cities are under a state system. And this state system then correctly was defined as white supremacy. I don't use the term anymore, but white supremacy. And you had sundowner towns where you couldn't be in town after the sunset and stuff. And you had some black towns that imposed those same rules on whites in Mississippi and places like that. So yeah, and that's why also when these towns were moved on and they fired some of them up, that was the state coming in. You know what I mean? Sometimes the National Guard, definitely the mob, definitely the police, you know. So with those types of organization, very necessary. If there's any questions here. Okay, a lot of this is comments between each other. Walt Manlu, good point. Learning the facts of our past prior to the enslavement period is crucial. Actually learning how our ancestors lived prior to the end of the worm glaciation age is critical. It's not funny. Yeah, because that's your roots. But some of us think that's a waste of time because it's got no application to today. And nobody else on the planet thinks like that. The European will take something minor like Greece and blow it up to be something great and completely shut out where it was great some of the sources coming out of African civilization, particularly Kemet. But they got a point in that they're at least trying to find some period in the past that they can locate their stuff on. We got so many, it's funny. And the more you know, the more you can do. Lao Tzu is saying it would be good to compile questions. Yeah, it sure would be. Lao Tzu, he's talking about if we can't discipline ourselves for long periods of time, what can we do? Yeah, true. I appreciate all the appreciation here. Let's see if there's anything else. Steve McKenzie, what is the fighting in the Sudan about? Is it because of General D? The elites there are in a struggle for power. I mean, that's the main thing. I'm going to be bringing on some people who have expertise in current African events, so we can go to these in detail. But it's these brainwashed elites that want to control power and wealth. If there's anything else here. Okay, let me go down here. Right now, African states, this is ancient African mindset. Right now, African states are struggling to identify and enact a state where these principles are in place. I'd like to know where. Because that is the biggest problem of the African independence movement, is that it inherited the European state system without questioning it. And whether they were socialists or capitalists, either one, they used that model. And that model will get you nowhere. Nyerere, who was one of the best leaders in Africa at that time, and Nkrumah was another, had some of the best policies for building up a strong African nation, drawing on Ujamaa or communal sharing. Didn't realize that the European nation state structure was the big problem. Cabral was just beginning to see it. He hadn't come to a full realization either by the time of his assassination. So I'd like to know where this is, where Africans are actually doing this. Okay. Ancient African mindset is saying he doesn't see the leaders yet. He hopes they emerge. Yeah, I do too. Oh, okay. He's referring to the head of Egyptian antiquities. I'm not from. I know that. Well, I'm not familiar with exactly what he's doing. Okay, let's see if there's anything. Ancient African mindset. The stateless systems are a model for Africa to adopt. Now, yeah, especially at the village level, where the basic decisions that are necessary for Africa's prosperity should be made. I mean, that's people live on the land. Everything's local. And the people who are driving the economy, that is agriculture, largely women, they are the ones that guarantee whether you eat or not, and yet they're not empowered. Generally they're not empowered. These state structures that answer to the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and their own interests too often use force and violence to stay in power. These are the ones that are often making decisions, and these decisions too often are not for the good of Africa. So giving the people the greatest say-so is key, and empowering African women is really key in that. So in my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, I have some proposals for restructuring nation states. Sheikh Anta Diop, in one of his works, Towards a Federated African continent, he has some proposals, and the two of ours are very similar. I didn't copy his. He certainly didn't copy mine. But yeah, that's what we have to think through. But that's the legacy of slavery and colonialism. It's going to take longer. Okay, that's it. Hotep, until next week.